Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Lefebvre, Senior Software Engineer here at Xojo, and I primarily work on Android and the Xojo IDE. And I'm here to give you all a deeper look at Android. All right, so let's just hit what some of the topics are we're going to cover today. I'm going to give you a brief technical background of Android and how it kind of works. We'll talk a bit about iOS and Android and what their similarities and differences are. And then we'll look at how you can make declares in Android, and we'll look at a few quick examples. And then I will show you how you can create a library in Android and also look at a couple examples. And then at the end, I'll take questions. So let's jump right in here. There were many false starts with Android. Android's a pretty different platform than all the other ones we kind of work with. So there was a lot of R&D efforts at the beginning that led to some things working, some paths started, sometimes you have to back up, that sort of thing. But eventually in 2019, we came up with a path that we thought would work. And that is what resulted in what you have today that we shipped back in August. So the main idea for how this works is your Xojo code is fed through a Kotlin transcompiler. And this is an all new thing, doesn't use a lot of the existing compiler that's in Xojo itself for the other platforms. Uses a small portion of it, but it's mostly the all new Kotlin transcompiler. And there is an entirely all new Kotlin based framework. You can see part of that in this giant image here on the right. Pretty good sized framework that is emulating, well, not emulating, but implementing the Xojo framework that you are used to using on all the other platforms. And the two of those combined are fed into the Kotlin compiler toolchain. And that's what produces your Android app. So again, this is different than how the other platforms are built and compiled and produced. And the last component of this entire Android thing is a standalone app called the Xojo Android Debug Bridge. And this handles the communication with the Android app when it's running in debug mode. And again, because the Java debugger that is running at the low level under the hood there communicates very differently than how the Xojo debugger normally communicates. This little bridge kind of translates the messaging between the two so that Xojo can understand what to display, and then the Android app gets the equivalent commands from Xojo regarding breakpoints and stepping and that sort of thing. The end result of all of this is that you get native Android runtime apps. Now, this is pretty important to get these type of apps. These are also referred to as ART, and they're the standard app that you really want to be using on the Android platform. And they have the benefit of running on pretty much any Android device. Right now, we're really only focusing on phones. But as we've shown at some of the XDC conferences and in other places, apps made with Xojo will actually run on a wide variety of things. They do run on tablets. They've been shown to work on some of the TV devices of all things. I think even Kindle Fires can run Xojo Android apps. And that's because they're standard Android runtime apps, so they work pretty much anywhere. So that's a bit about the technical background. Certainly, if you have other more specific questions in the Q&A session at the end, I'll be happy to answer them. So now, iOS and Android, both of our mobile platforms. iOS has been around since late 20, 2013 or 14, around 2013-14 timeframe. And Android just has been in testing for a while, but it was just released as part of Xojo back in August. So there are a lot of similarities, but there's also quite a bit of differences. So one of the big things that you get with Android that you do not get with iOS is something called side loading. And this is pretty cool. It allows you to load a built app onto your device without having to go through an app store. Something that people really, really want with iOS. And Apple's been reluctant to make that available, although they might have their hand forced perhaps by the European Union in coming years. But with Android, it's not really a problem. You can build your own app. You do not have to put it into the Google Play Store, although you can if you want. There are already some people that have made Xojo apps for Android and have them in the Play Store. But you don't have to do that. You can just build the app. You could put it on your website as a download link, and people could install and download it that way. And this sort of thing is super handy for particularly consultants. We've noticed that probably building an app that has no reason to ever live in an app store. And this makes it a lot easier to get that out to the people that need it. Now, as you're working in either iOS and Android, you'll be well aware of the mobile framework controls and classes. These are, the star here doesn't mean footnote. It actually meant to be a wildcard, but it kind of makes it look a little bit like a footnote thing. This just means everything that starts with mobile. And for the most part, the mobile framework itself is the same or very similar across iOS and Android. It's not exactly the same, and certainly the implementations under the hood are completely different. But the APIs and what's available is largely the same. One thing to highlight is screens are subtly different between iOS and Android. Android only has the mobile screen class, control, whatever you lay out, where you design your user interface. iOS has both a screen and then a layout where you can kind of combine screens onto it for various things. It's especially useful when designing iPad layouts, where you may want a split screen that has one screen on the left and a larger one on the right, sort of thing. Android doesn't support that sort of thing yet, and it may not. It all depends on what we end up doing for some of the design there. But that is a difference to keep in mind. Android has built-in theming. So in your Android app, you can write in the Xojo IDE, you can go to the app inspector and choose from a variety of built-in themes that match the Android's material design theme colors, or you can specify your own colors for a variety of things. Android has a control that iOS does not have called Tab Panel. iOS does have tabs. They're more of a navigation type thing. They're created as part of the layout where you can specify different screens that are shown when you tap on the tab control navigator thing at the bottom of an iOS phone app, for example. Android doesn't implement that at this point, but it has the tab panel control, which works more like the tab panel you may have seen in a web or a desktop app. It's a control you put on your layout, and then within each tab in the control, you can assign a container that'll be displayed when they tap on a particular tab. The other control that is different between iOS and Android is table. And essentially, iOS has its own specific table and Android has its own specific table. The tables are they have an API that's very tied to the underlying implementation of table on each platform. So they didn't really lend themselves well to being shared across both. But we do have a plan to come up with a more generic table that will work the same across iOS and Android. And then we'll we'll keep around the more platform specific ones for when some particular feature is needed there that we can't implement in a shared one. But for now, they are distinct controls. And Android has a few more framework limitations than iOS does at this point. If you recall, iOS got its framework dramatically improved and enhanced back in 2021, maybe, where it brought in a bunch of stuff that was missing from iOS for many years, things like XML and some other stuff like that, regex and stuff like that. And also there's a data type things to keep in mind with Android. For example, on Android, the integer type is always int 64. You can't say, oh, I want to use int 8. I mean, you can say that, but it'll always be treated as int 64. So the stuff like that to keep in mind. There is a full document you can access on our blog and doc site that lists all the very specifics in far as little details as to what the differences are. These are kind of the highlights. And then I mentioned the class differences. Android does not yet have things like XML document or regex or PDF or charts that are currently available on iOS. We do plan to get those added over time, but they're just not there yet. And speaking of longer term plans, we do also plan to get the iOS and Android project types consolidated into a single mobile project type. So it would work more like you're used to with desktop, where there's just one project type and there's just checkboxes in the build area where you say, I want to build this for iOS, or I want to build this for Android, or I want to build it for both. But we're not there yet. Android was so new and so different that it was probably too high of a risk to try and inject that directly into iOS at the when it was being built. All right, so let's talk a bit about declares, because they do allow you to access some things that are not yet built into the Xojo Android framework. So here you can see a couple screenshots from the code editor of a couple declares that access some things in the lower level Android Java-based framework, Kotlin-based framework. The two kind of are intermixed. And that's what declares do. They allow you to call into the native Android framework methods. And currently, they can only make calls into things that are global or specific control objects. So you can see this screenshot here has two declares. One at the top is a global call just into a math function that's sitting in the Java language math namespace. And the one below it is calling a, let's see, a method, or I get a method / property of another property that's on the HTML viewer control. So when you're writing declares, probably the big thing you'll have to remember is just the data type mapping. And there's just, if you have something that's a string, in Xojo, you have to use cstring for that within a declare statement. And if you see stuff that is an int or long on the Android side, you would use integer for that on the Xojo side. So let's take a look at an example here. This is the simpler ABS math example for gets the absolute value. Xojo obviously has this already built in, but this is an example of a function to call. If you're bored, you can't sleep one night, you can bring up the official Android documentation site and scour through that until you're long asleep, fast asleep. Lots of stuff in there. So you can see on the left side here, it says math, and it tells you the name of the class. And then more importantly, at the bottom part there, it tells you the specific namespace it's located in. So that's useful information. And then on the right, you see the method name is called ABS. It has the actual function declaration, tells you it's public, tells you it's static, that and tells you that it is global. And then here it tells you the data types. Returns a long, takes a long as a parameter. And then at the bottom, you can see how the declare to call this particular thing would be written. And just to point out the various pieces and how they match up. So that's where the namespace goes. That's the lib that you're accessing, the library. And then the function name, you can put here in the alias section. You don't really have to do that if the function at the beginning has the exact same name. So where I have declare function my ABS, if I just written ABS there, then it wouldn't need the alias. But Xojo has ABS built in, so that could cause conflicts there. So it's nice to use the alias if you want to make sure you're calling the exact name, but that would be the name of the framework thing that you're calling. And then the parameters go into the parameter section with the type converted appropriately. And then the return type is at the end in Xojo rather than the beginning, as it would be in Kotlin. So that's how that kind of maps together. Now, this picture, I will get this in a blog post or in the docs or something somewhere at some point. This tells you the Xojo controls and what they're using under the hood for the Android framework control. And this is useful because if you do need to look up something in the Android docs, you can go to the appropriate Android framework control doc page and see what it has for methods and properties and that sort of thing. So you can see something like, mobile button is using a material button. And then you can go to the material button doc page and see all the many things it has accessible there and see if there's something there that you want to take advantage of. There are a few things on this list that just have NA for not yet available. And those are just because they don't directly subclass something. So kind of has a different design, and the actual control that's used is not yet exposed. So you can't directly access it to call things on it. But that will change over time. So you need to look at this now and memorize it before I move to the next page. All right, just kidding. But now let's switch over to Xojo and just look at these again in a little bit more detail. All right, so I have here a project that will change the background color of a button. So you can see I have a declare statement here, and it's not using the alias. So this here would be the exact name of the method that's in the Android framework. This is an object to declare. So it has the object prefix and then the information about that. And then it calls it. And then because that was written as an extension method, I can call it on the button itself and pass in the color. And if I run this, when I click the button, it should turn blue. And yay, it does. So that's pretty cool. You can start to tweak some things there. And we got another one here to look at. Let's see. Let's look at we'll go to the declare one. This has the ABS method, which we already looked at. And this also has another one that does a call into an odd looking namespace here to get the specific Android version. And these are called, just like regular functions once you've written the declare command. So just my ABS with a value and then the Android version written there. So if I run this, You can see the results up here. Android version is 14 in this emulator, and the ABS of -10 is 10. And the last one here is getting the user agent of HTML viewer. This is actually came up on the forum a week or two ago. Someone was asking how to get and set this, and I said, oh, I bet a declare would work for that. So I put that together and posted it to the forum for the customer. So you can see here, this is another object declare called get user agent string, and it's on the settings property of mobile HTML viewer, which, if you remember looking at that chart that I had up a little earlier that you've all memorized, is a web view. So a web view has a property called settings, and there are a variety of settings on there, and one of them is user agent string, so we can get access to it. And you can see the very long mobile user agent string. All right, so those are just a few declares that you can see how they're kind of done. And I also want to point out the Android Design Extensions project, which has hundreds of declares you can use in your Android projects. This was created by Xojo MVP Martin, and he's been instrumental in helping us get Android out the door and with testing and other things. And he created this Android Design Extensions project, which is available on GitHub. And you can grab it from there. And it literally has hundreds of declares. So it's you can see some of the things you can do here with the label and changing how they look. So it's got some slick stuff in there that can really jazz up your apps. And it also serves as a great template for seeing how a declare should be written, because at this point, Martin has certainly created and written more declares than I have because of how many that are in this project. So, if you're looking to make a declare to something that isn't in this project, something else perhaps, you can maybe go here to find an example that might help you get started. So thank you very much, Martin, for creating that project. And there's also a blog post kind of summarizing it that you can read on the Xojo blog. But now let's move on to libraries. Because sometimes there'll be something you want to access that you can't really do through declare. So the next step is the library. And libraries right now are in their very early days. They're a little limited, as we'll see in a moment, but they're a start, and they will improve over time. So a library is something you actually create with Android Studio. And it is technically a Kotlin library, also known as an AAR, which is an Android archive. And that's essentially a bundle of the what you build as the library. And currently, you can only access Kotlin class companion objects. As you can see here on the source code on the right, there's a class called regex, and underneath it is something that says companion object. And you can kind of think of that as essentially stuff that would be equivalent to Xojo shared methods. So they're essentially global. And that's kind of important at this point because we don't really have a direct way to deal with instances of stuff that's in a library yet. We will eventually. So yeah, these are not class instances. They have to be global things, but you can still do quite a bit with them. And to call stuff in the library, you go through declares. So it's a good thing you are now all pros in writing declares. So you will be using that skill to access things that are in your libraries. So the overall steps is in Android Studio, you create the library. And then I left out the other important, easy step, which is, write the code. But then you build the library as an AAR file. And then in Xojo, you would use a copy file build step to copy the library file to the frameworks folder. And this puts it in the appropriate place so that it gets built into the app and can then be accessed using a declare, which is the next step. You actually call what you want on the library with a declare. So let's look at this example here. This is got a couple of screenshots. The one on the left is Android Studio. And you can see here, this has a class called regex that is in the com.example.utility package. And it has on that class a companion object with one function, regex match. And it will take a string containing some regex and then some text, and it'll check if that text is matched by the regex and return true or false. And you can see how the declare is written and how that's used in Xojo code. So let's see how the parts line up again. So you can see the name. Here is the exact name for the declare function. So there's no alias in this statement. And then the class is combined with the package to give you the library that you're accessing. So com.example.utility.regex. And then the parameters are converted to Xojo types. And then lastly, the return type. Let's take a look at that and a couple other library examples here. So first, we'll just look at this exact one that's here. And let's take a look at that in Android Studio as well. So you can see it here in Android Studio, just like this screenshot showed. When you create the library, the other thing you'll want to tweak is, hang on, I'm just trying to move this window out of the way so I can access the control on it. There we go. There's one setting that you need to tweak ever so slightly in order for the library to be compatible with the Xojo Android builds. And yes, Android Studio can be a very scary, confusing mess, but once you've used it a bit, you can usually find what you're looking for. And here is a configuration file called a build Gradle file. And the important thing here is that the version of Kotlin needs to be set to 1.6.20. I think it defaults to 1.8 currently in Android Studio. And the Xojo framework is not yet built against 1.8. So if you tried to build a library against 1.8, it wouldn't work with Xojo yet. Xojo will be moving up to newer versions of Kotlin, but not for this initial release. And your code here, same as before, again, pretty simple. And, building that, you would just go down to rebuild project here, and you'd end up with a AAR file that you can then use with the copy file build steps back in Xojo, as you can see here. And if we run this, you can see the first two tests matched the regex that was passed in, but the last test didn't. And then this one is more of a sample to just demonstrate how library stuff can be hooked up. Doesn't really do anything too useful. But you can see here, this just creates another class with a companion object that has a few demo functions to test off returning values. And, in here, you could put any Kotlin code you wanted to write in here. You could access specific parts of the Kotlin framework as long as you do have access to it. Some things may require additional information about the application that we don't yet provide to the library. But again, like I said, these are early days and that sort of thing will be added over time. But you can certainly create functions that return integers, strings, booleans, do things, and get the value back in Xojo. And this one is pretty simple. So the declares just have the package name, the name of the function, and then the types. And same with the copy step, copying the actual library. And it returned all the values. So that passed our test. So that's great. So the library concept, as you can see there, works for some things. This, what you specifically want to build is up to you. Go try some things. Like I said, take a gander at the Android docs if there's a particular feature you're looking for and see if that's something that you might be able to implement in the library or in a library. And certainly ask questions on the forum. And if you've created something, tell people about it. Share it in the forum. You can put it on GitHub. You can do what you like. All right. So now it is time for questions. And I'm sure you all have plenty of questions. But before I jump into those, I just wanted to point out the Xojo blog, which I mentioned a couple times previously. There's a category for Android-related posts. You might want to check those out. In particular, there are some posts on declare and libraries that will give you, more specific steps for how to do those things that you can refer to perhaps more easily. And of course, the forum where you can share declares you've written or ask questions if there's one thing you're trying to access and maybe you're stumped. All right, so the first question I want to take is why is int 8 or int 16, et cetera, being handled as int 64? And right now, the reasoning is just that those particular types were still, I think the term they had was experimental in the Kotlin version we're using. So they are not really recommended for full use just yet. So I will continue to evaluate that and see if it makes sense to put them in. I mean, frankly, most of those types aren't super useful in Kotlin. They're more, those size specific types are useful for direct OS calls, kind of classic OS calls that require things to be a certain size and with structures and stuff like that. So not having these isn't all that, it doesn't really hurt you much on the Android side, at least not at the moment. Edwin is asking when he looked at the declare example that changed the button color, I had a color.toInteger method. And that was actually another method in that sample project. It's not built into the framework. And Dirk is asking, what happened to the interops? That's a good question. That kind of relates to the first bit when I was talking about many false starts. The interops kind of ended up being a false start. So that's kind of what happened to them. There was a bit of work done on them. We had made some progress. Some of them were working, but in the end, it didn't prove to be a viable thing that was going to get us to the finish line. I got a question here to share the Android regex library and project on the forum. And those are shared in the blog post right now, which you can certainly repost that to the forum if you wanted. But they are links to those projects are downloadable directly from the library blog post, which you can find by the link you see right here on the screen, and it should be in the list there, not too far down. Tim is asking if I can talk a bit about or show a demo of the mobile pop-up menu control that's coming in 2023 R3. I could talk about it. I can't really show a demo. I'm not set up for that at the moment. That would require a developer build that I do not have running. But the pop-up menu control for Android is an Android-specific control. It's not actually available on iOS. And behind the scenes, it's what's called a spinner. So it essentially looks like a pop-up menu. It gives you a thing you can tap on, and you get kind of a pop-up / drop-down menu of selections that you can tap, and then you get back an event that has, and then you can see what was selected. So it's not a complicated control, but neither is the regular pop-up menu control. But it's pretty handy. Previously, you would probably have to create like a modal screen, put a table on it, and then pop that up, let someone pick something from the table, and then close the modal screen. So it's a good way to quickly let a user choose a value. You don't generally want a lot of values in that list, but that's how that works. All right, Greg is asking here regarding declares. The library seems to point to a particular control on a layout. And yes, that is correct. It points to a particular control on a layout. So that, well, in this particular case, it is pointing to, oh yes, I see it is pointing to HTML viewer 1 and then the mobile HTML viewer subclass. I kind of thought that might have been pointing to the parameter passed in of control. Oh, that was for the user agent one. Sorry, I'm thinking of the different one. But yes, that's because this particular declare is right on that layout, if I remember right. If you were passing in a variable, like if it were an extension method or something like that, rather than using HTML viewer 1 there, you would use the variable name or whatever. Let's see, Tim is asking, are Android libraries supported in 2023 R2, or are they coming in R3? They are supported in R2. That's what I'm running was running right here for these demos I showed you was R2. They are supported there. There will be a couple tweaks to R3 that might help with libraries and declares. In particular, there's a new app, well, Android setting, I guess, that lets you specify manifest permissions, which you sometimes need depending on what declare or stuff in the library you're using. So you can put the permission constant in there, and then that'll be embedded into the app manifest, which is just the Android configuration file where these things are stored. So that's a little tweak that will be coming in R3, but you can certainly use both of these features now in R2. All right, I got a question here from Jure. How to set an Android app so that it is always active. I'm not sure I know exactly what that means, but Xojo apps are generally not that way, at least not the mobile apps. It's not like you can fire up an app that is permanently running in the background. Apps are a little bit more transient than that, I suppose. Maybe there are declares that let you set one such that you can do that. I really don't know offhand. All right, we got a question from UA, and he said, "Did I understand this correctly? it should be possible to use PDF viewing functionality out of the Android framework by declares to Xojo Android. So I think maybe he's thinking, oh, I could declare into Xojo libraries to access things. But no, alas, you cannot do that. Libraries have to be written in Kotlin. And other than the Android framework, nothing else in Xojo is. So no, there wouldn't be any way to declare to that. Say the one thing in the Android framework that is not written in Kotlin is the SQLite libraries, which is a build directly from the SQLite people for Android. But that is interfaced through an Android library. And I mean, theoretically, you could rebuild stuff in that manner, but that's rather tedious, and not many binary type libraries are distributed that way. Arthur is asking, how does Kotlin/Android compare to Xojo for supporting deprecated features? Well, in general, Kotlin/Android loves deprecating features. I know a lot of people complain that Xojo might deprecate things too often, but compared to other tool sets, that's not even close. Kotlin and Android stuff is deprecated a lot, and they make that manageable by setting versions of Kotlin that things are required and using conditionals to check for that sort of thing. So I mean, yeah, they do have a cool feature that in Android Studio that Xojo doesn't have, that I kind of think would be neat, is if you try to use something that's deprecated, it shows in the code editor with a line through it, like a strike through. Kind of really encouraging you not to go that route. But for example, a big thing that the Kotlin Android folks deprecated during our development of Android was something that had been around since the inception, which was something they called synthetics, which allowed you direct access to essentially controls on the layout without having to do any other specific work to hook them up. And they kind of deprecated that and said, hey, if you want to start using newer versions of Kotlin, you need to change all your code. And that's a pretty big deal, pretty big change. We have not yet switched the Android framework to work around that. So we're still using that deprecated feature at this point. But the beauty is when we flip our framework and our transcompiler to work a different way, none of you will even notice. Everything will just be built the same as it is for you currently, but behind the scenes, it will use the newer mechanisms. All right, question from Greg on libraries. When Xojo does move up to a new Kotlin framework version, will libraries need to be recompiled? No, as long as the library version is not ahead of the Xojo version, you'll be fine. The problem currently is that we're a little bit behind where we want to be, with 1.8 being the current version used for new Android Studio projects, but Xojo still using 1.6. So when Xojo moves up, as long as your library is below the Xojo version, things will be fine. Dirk is asking about the barcode scanner sample by Travis. Will this be shared? I actually don't remember that one. I'm drawing a blank, but I don't see why we couldn't share that. I'll have to check with Travis. I'm making a note. All right, Ken has a question. What is the general experience with converting iOS apps to Android? The general experience. Well, we've had some people that have done that. without too much trouble. And then we've had some people with large projects where it's taking a bit of time. And I guess it all depends on where you're coming from. From my perspective, it probably would make the most sense to start with a new Android project and move things over a bit, piece by piece, rather than try to just essentially copy over the entire iOS project into Android and then try to run it and make changes or whatnot. With Android still is beta, even though it's in the main product. So you still will run into issues. So if you do it bit by bit, piece by piece, screen by screen, maybe, or something like that, you get a much better shot of finding problems early and getting them taken care of, or reporting them if there's an actual bug we need to fix, rather than kind of doing the whole thing all at once and then maybe getting overwhelmed. But I mean, for the most part, it's not too bad. It really depends on the complexity of your projects. I mean, a lot of the example projects that are included with Xojo for Android were straight conversions of the equivalent iOS ones and usually required little to no changes. All right, Jordan is asking, given the current Slip projects, what's the best way to share code between an iOS app and an Android app? I had probably a typo in there, but the last part of the sentence, what's the best way to share code between an iOS app and an Android app? You can share code the same way that you would with any other, sharing code between any other two project types. I actually did a full session on this back at XDC in London that walks through some examples of a desktop, web, iOS, and Android project and how they share code and the different ways you can do that. So you should head over to our YouTube channel and search for that. They would all be on the YouTube channel. That's from the conference that was at the end of April this year. All right, the last question I have on here is from Jeremy asking, which theme am I using in Android Studio? And that is a new theme for Android Studio. I think it's, I don't think it's the official theme yet. I think I had to go into preferences in Android Studio and flip it on. Again, it might be in a beta or an experimental section. But I do prefer it over the old theme. I've been using it for a couple of weeks now. It's not bad. So you can just flip it on or off. Doesn't really change any of the functionality about it. It just kind of shuffle things around and I don't know, made the overall UI a little cleaner to my taste. And Greg lets me end it with a fun little question. Am I completely burnt out from working on Android? I have been working on Android for a long time. It all depends. Some days I'm like, oh no, what on earth is that I have to look into? But no, for the most part, working on Android has been quite enjoyable. Kotlin is a perfectly fine language. It has its quirks, as they all do. And it was surprising to me that there are actually some things that Xojo has that you cannot do in Kotlin, which was surprising. But anyway, no, probably the most annoying part about working with Android is using Android Studio. As Jeremy asked before, I do find the new theme a little easier on the eyes, so that's nice. But that is it, my last question. So I do want to thank everyone for attending. And if you need to refer to anything in this video, it will be on YouTube shortly. And if you have any questions, again, you got my email address there. You can always shoot me a question or post on something in the forum. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.